June 1944. In the gray dawn light of occupied France, the air was heavy with the hiss of steam. Along rail sidings from Rouen to Chartres, locomotives stood under pressure, their boilers alive, their steel wheels waiting to turn. These were the veins and arteries of Hitler's empire, feeding his armies at the front with tanks, fuel, and artillery. The black smoke of coal-fired engines drifted into the morning sky, a familiar rhythm of German occupation life. But this day would not follow its rhythm. At first it was a distant vibration, faint, uncertain, like thunder beyond the horizon. Then the sound deepened, multiplied, and became unmistakable, the harsh growl of Pratt & Whitney radial engines. The earth trembled as dozens of American P-47 Thunderbolts, the aircraft the Germans called Jabos, fighter bombers, swept in low over the fields of France. Their wide, rugged wings caught the sun, glinting against the haze. German crews looked up in terror. For months, they had endured Allied bombers far above, but this was different. These fighters were not passing overhead on their way to distant cities. They had come for the lifeline itself, the locomotives and rail yards that kept the Wehrmacht moving. The first salvo of rockets streaked down, white smoke trails cutting through the air. An instant later, the rails erupted. A locomotive was struck squarely, its boiler bursting into a geyser of scalding steam. Steel shrapnel tore through the air as men flung themselves from coal tenders and rail cars. Then came the thunder of 50-caliber machine guns. 8 heavy barrels per aircraft stitched fiery lines across the yards, bullets chewing through iron and flesh alike. One locomotive after another was crippled. Boilers burst, wheels lifted from the rails, tenders overturned. Engineers and railway guards ran for cover, some diving into ditches, others frozen in disbelief as the jugs roared past so low that their slipstreams rocked boxcars on the siding. By the time the last thunderbolt banked away, the smoke of 80 destroyed or disabled locomotives blackened the horizon. The arteries of supply had been cut in a single brutal day. Trains that should have carried tanks and ammunition to Normandy lay in ruins, their twisted hulks silent on the rails. In Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, once the proud architect of the Luftwaffe, was forced to confront the unthinkable. He had promised Hitler that the skies over Europe belonged to Germany. Yet on this day, he could do nothing but rage as American Thunderbolts dismantled the Reich's railways before his eyes. The day the trains stopped was more than a raid. It was the revelation of a new truth, that American air power could strike not only cities or factories, but the very heartbeat of the German war machine. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never meant to be graceful. Where the Spitfire embodied elegance and the Messerschmitt Bf 109 was sharp and angular, the Thunderbolt was a brute, broad-shouldered, heavy, and unapologetically rugged. Its birth lay not in sleek artistry, but in the urgent demands of total war. The man behind its creation was Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who fled the Russian Revolution and made his way to the United States. At Republic Aviation, Kartveli's task was formidable. Design a fighter capable of taking on the Luftwaffe at high altitude while surviving the punishing demands of long-range escort duty. What emerged from his drawing board in 1940 was unlike anything the world had yet seen. At its heart was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that delivered more than 2,000 horsepower. It was one of the most powerful engines of the war, and it gave the Thunderbolt both speed and raw climbing power. Yet power came with weight. The jug tipped the scales at over 7 tons when loaded, nearly twice the weight of a Spitfire. Pilots joked that it was like flying a bathtub with wings, but what a bathtub it was. Wrapped in thick armor plating, with a bubble canopy for visibility and self-sealing fuel tanks, the P-47 could absorb punishment that would rip lesser fighters apart. Luftwaffe pilots soon learned that shooting down a Thunderbolt was no easy feat. American airmen took comfort in its resilience, often limping home with wings riddled by flak, engines coughing, yet still aloft. The jug's true sting lay in its firepower. Each wing carried 4 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 8 in total, delivering a combined weight of metal that shredded aircraft, armor, and locomotives alike. Unlike the lightweight armament of early warfighters, the Thunderbolts' guns were designed to smash. Pilots reported tearing German planes out of the sky with a single burst, or slicing through locomotives until boilers burst under the relentless hail. Initially, the P-47 was envisioned as a high-altitude interceptor. In 1943, Thunderbolt squadrons began flying escort missions over occupied Europe, protecting the massive bomber streams of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators. But its destiny lay elsewhere. Once the sleeker, longer-ranged P-51 Mustang took over the escort role, the Jug was freed for a different task, descending to low altitudes and unleashing havoc upon the ground. There, its heavy armor, massive engine, and devastating firepower found their perfect purpose. The P-47 became the scourge of German railways, convoys, and armored columns. Kartvel's brute with wings was exactly what the Allies needed. An aircraft that could fight, endure, and destroy with merciless efficiency. The Jug was not beautiful. It was not elegant, but it was feared. And in war, fear was often more powerful than beauty. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not only a triumph of design, it was the child of American industry at its peak, an industry that could turn blueprints into squadrons, and squadrons into fleets that darkened the skies. In 1942, while Europe still lay under Nazi rule, the assembly lines of the United States were already roaring. At Republic Aviation's massive plant in Farmingdale, Long Island, workers labored in shifts around the clock. The hangars echoed with the ring of rivet guns, the clang of steel, and the hum of conveyor belts that moved partially built fuselages down the line like automobiles in Detroit. Women in overalls tightened bolts, checked wiring, and painted insignias, while men fitted engines and mounted wings. The scale was staggering. At its height, Republic produced nearly one Thunderbolt every hour. Between 1941 and 1945, over 15,000 P-47s rolled from the factory floor, more than any other American fighter of the war. In Connecticut and New Jersey, subcontractors delivered engines, radios, and propellers. The Pratt & Whitney plant in East Hartford shipped its massive R-2800 engines by the trainload, each a masterpiece of precision engineering. Curtiss-Wright supplied propellers the size of barn doors. Truck convoys rumbled daily, feeding the industrial beast that transformed raw materials into machines of war. This was not a miracle of a single company, but of an entire nation mobilized. America's industrial strategy was simple: overwhelm the enemy not only with courage and tactics, but with numbers so vast they could not be countered. By 1944, Republic Aviation had employed over 24,000 workers, most of them civilians with no connection to aviation before the war. Housewives, farmhands, and students learned to rivet, solder, and weld. They built the Jug piece by piece, thousands of hands creating a weapon that would carry American pilots across the skies of Europe. The Germans could not match this scale. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's own production was crippled by Allied bombing raids, factories scattered and hidden in forests, output shrinking with every month. Göring's Luftwaffe might still have aces and courage, but against America's tide of machines, courage was not enough. The Thunderbolt itself became a symbol of this industrial colossus. When formations of Jugs lifted from English airfields and crossed the Channel, they were not only the product of pilots and squadrons, they were the product of an entire society turned to war. Each rivet hammered in Farmingdale, each engine tuned in Hartford, was a blow against the Reich. The P-47 was proof of what the arsenal of democracy could do. When Alexander Kartvel's design left the drawing board, it needed the might of a nation to bring it to life. And America delivered. In steel, in sweat, and in numbers that no enemy could hope to rival. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first took to the skies over Europe in 1943, it carried a mission as daunting as its bulk: escort the heavy bombers that were striking deep into German-held territory. Flying in tight formations, B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators pushed toward industrial targets in the Ruhr and beyond. Their survival depended on fighters that could hold their own against Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The Jug performed admirably in that role. Its 8 heavy machine guns and thick armor made it a dangerous opponent in a dogfight, especially at high altitude where its massive turbocharged engine excelled. Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned to respect the Thunderbolt, even as they mocked its size. But despite its strengths, the P-47 had limitations. Its range was shorter than what was needed to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. That role would eventually fall to the P-51 Mustang, with its long legs and nimble handling. Yet what might have seemed a weakness became an opportunity. Freed from long-range escort duty, Thunderbolt squadrons were reassigned to a mission that suited them even better: ground attack. The Jug's toughness, firepower, and sheer bulk made it nearly indestructible in low-level strikes. It could carry rockets under its wings, 500-pound bombs beneath its fuselage, and still unleash its full arsenal of machine guns. It was here, screaming in just above the treetops, that the Thunderbolt earned its fearsome reputation. Pilots trained to swoop down in staggered formations, their engines thundering so low that they rattled windows in French villages. They struck columns of German trucks, tearing them apart in seconds. They blasted bridges with rockets, cratering the spans into useless rubble. And when locomotives came into view, black engines pounding forward with plumes of smoke, the Jug became a predator, diving on its prey with merciless precision. The shift from escort to fighter bomber was not without risk. Flak batteries lined roads and rail yards. Pilots often returned with holes punched through wings and fuselages, engines coughing from shrapnel damage. Some never returned at all. But the Jug's resilience gave its crews confidence. Pilots told stories of limping back across the channel, with entire cylinders shot out, of landing on English fields with wings shredded yet still intact. By late 1943 and into 1944, the baptism of fire had forged the Thunderbolt into something more than a protector. It had become a weapon of disruption, the hammer that smashed the enemy's supply lines, the scourge of locomotives and bridges. Its destiny was no longer to merely defend the bombers. Its destiny was to strangle the German war machine where it lived, on the rails, in the convoys, and on the roads of occupied Europe. June 1944. The Normandy beaches were secured, but the battle for France was only beginning. The German army still had teeth, and it still had men. Divisions of tanks and infantry waiting in reserve. What it needed was movement. Movement meant trains. Every shell, every tank, every fresh battalion relied on steel rails to reach the front. If the trains stopped, the German army would bleed. The Allies knew this, and on a single furious day, the Thunderbolt set out to make it happen. The orders went out at dawn. P-47 squadrons of the 9th Air Force were tasked with sweeping the rail networks of northern France. Their instructions were precise: cripple locomotives, smash rail yards, choke the arteries feeding the front. Pilots strapped themselves into cockpits that reeked of oil and metal, tugged oxygen masks into place, and throttled forward. The R-2800 engines roared to life, filling the airfields of southern England with a thunder that could be heard for miles. By mid-morning, the Jugs crossed the channel in tight formations, their wingtips almost brushing. Below them stretched the quilted fields of occupied France. Every town held danger. Flak gunners hid in church towers and woods, yet the pilots pressed low, skimming the hedgerows. Their prey was ahead. Near Dreux, the first locomotive was sighted, a massive black engine dragging freight cars heavy with munitions. The squadron leader dipped his wings, signaling the attack. The Thunderbolts fanned out and dove. Rockets shrieked from beneath their wings, white trails slicing through the sky. The first salvo missed, erupting in fields beside the tracks. The second struck true. The locomotive's boiler burst like a volcano, a plume of steam engulfing the cars as engineers leapt from the cab. Moments later, machine guns raked the wreck, bullets chewing through steel, coal, and... The squadron pulled up, but more trains were already in sight. Railway yards at Chartres and Le Mans seethed with steam engines preparing for departure. The Thunderbolts descended again, cannons of fire unleashed in unrelenting fury. Locomotives exploded one after another. Some toppled on their sides, wheels still spinning uselessly in the air. Others burned fiercely, flames licking at wooden freight cars until entire yards became infernos. The Germans fought back with everything they had. Flak batteries filled the sky with black puffs. Tracers clawed upward in desperate arcs. A thunderbolt took a direct hit, flames spitting from its wing. The pilot, instead of bailing out, drove his crippled aircraft straight at the target, releasing his rockets in a final pass that destroyed another locomotive before he slammed into a field beyond the rails. His squadron mates roared past, saluting his sacrifice. By afternoon, the slaughter continued. The sound was deafening. Engines screaming, guns hammering, trains bursting in clouds of shrapnel and steam. Villagers hid in cellars, peering out through cracks as the sky itself seemed to tear apart. German railway workers abandoned their posts, running from the yards as the Jug's shadow swept over them. For them, there was no defense. When the Thunderbolts finally turned for home, the landscape was transformed. Across northern France, 80 locomotives lay wrecked or crippled in a single day. Some were burned-out hulks, their iron frames twisted and blackened. Others stood frozen, boilers burst, silent monuments to destruction. The rails, once arteries of conquest, were now graveyards of iron. In Berlin, reports flooded in, reports that horrified the Reich leadership. Göring had once promised Hitler that Allied aircraft would never dare dominate the skies of Europe. Now, American fighters prowled not just the skies, but the very railways that fed the German war machine. Göring raged, but there was little left to rage with. His Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, unable to stop the American tide. The massacre of locomotives was not only a victory of tactics, it was a symbol. In a single day, the Thunderbolt proved that the Reich's strength could be choked, strangled, and left powerless, not indistant. The numbers told the story of victory. 80 locomotives wrecked in a single day. But behind the statistics were the men, young Americans, scarcely older than boys, who strapped themselves into the cockpits of Thunderbolts and flew into the furnace. Their voices bring to life what the battle truly felt like. Lieutenant Charles Red Fulkerson of the 362nd Fighter Group later recalled the first moment he sighted a train. "It was like hunting a steel monster," he said. "You could see the smokestack pumping, the wheels hammering the rails. When we rolled in, I could feel the jug shake as the guns opened up. The rounds tore straight through the boiler, and suddenly it was like a volcano. Steam, fire, everything blowing outward. I remember seeing figures jumping from the cab. It was over in seconds, but it's burned in my mind forever." For many pilots, the sensation was a mixture of adrenaline and terror. Flying at treetop level meant there was no room for error. A single mistake, one clipped wingtip against a tree, or one well-placed burst of flak, could end it all. Lieutenant William Mac McKee wrote in his diary after the raid, "I could smell coal smoke and burning oil even through the cockpit. The ground shook from the explosions. You tell yourself you're flying a mission, doing your job, but in truth, every pass feels like gambling with death." Yet amid the terror, there was also grim pride. The Thunderbolt's resilience became the pilot's shield. Captain George Bostwick described limping back across the channel with half his wing shredded. "The Jug kept flying. Any other bird would have folded up. She got me home. That's why we loved her. She could take punishment and still bring you back." Losses were inevitable. Squadrons mourned the men who didn't return, often in silence. A fellow pilot's empty bunk spoke louder than any speech. Letters were written to mothers and wives, carefully worded so as not to reveal the worst horrors. And yet, for those who survived, there was the unshakable memory of what they had accomplished. They hadn't just destroyed machines, they had severed the arteries of an empire. Through their voices, the locomotive massacre becomes more than a statistic. It becomes a memory of sweat, smoke, and sacrifice, of men who faced the black bursts of flak and the scream of enemy tracers, and who struck with the full weight of America's industrial and human power. For the men on the ground in occupied France, the day of the locomotive massacre was a waking nightmare. In towns like Le Mans, Chartres, and Dreux, German railway workers and Wehrmacht officers watched the skies darken with the shapes of thunderbolts. To them, the scream of diving engines and the thunder of rockets was not just terrifying, it was the sound of inevitability. The railway system had long been the backbone of German power in the West. From ammunition to reinforcements, every essential of war moved along the rails. Engineers, stokers, and guards worked in grim determination, knowing that Allied air superiority grew with each month. Still, nothing prepared them for the fury unleashed that day. When the first attack struck, chaos tore through the yards. Locomotives erupted in clouds of white-hot steam as boilers ruptured. Iron wheels spun helplessly in the air as crippled engines toppled on their sides. Railway crews leapt from cabs, some scalded, others deafened, all desperate to survive. Wehrmacht officers shouted orders to flak batteries, but their defenses were meager. Black puffs of 20mm and 37mm shells rose skyward, but the jugs thundered through, shrugging off shrapnel as they pressed home their runs. Reports flowed in to German command centers in Paris and Berlin. One officer described the scene bluntly. "Our trains are being butchered like cattle. The yards are burning. We cannot move." Panic spread through the chain of command. Every division waiting to counterattack in Normandy depended on those rails. Without them, tanks would sit idle, fuel would run dry, and soldiers would wait in frustration as their supplies failed to arrive. Among the railway workers themselves, despair ran deep. Many were conscripts or forced laborers, drafted from occupied countries. For them, the roar of the Thunderbolts was both terror and strange relief. They feared the bombs, but they also knew that every locomotive destroyed brought liberation closer. For German officers, however, there was no such consolation. They faced only the humiliation of helplessness. In Berlin, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring was incandescent with rage. Once, in 1939, he had boasted that, "No enemy bomber will reach the Ruhr or Berlin. If they do, you may call me Meyer." By 1944, his promise was a bitter joke. Not only had Allied bombers devastated the cities of the Reich, now low-flying American fighter bombers were dismantling the logistical lifelines of occupied Europe. Göring ranted at his staff, demanding to know why the Luftwaffe had failed to defend the railways. But the truth was clear. There were no reserves left. The Luftwaffe's strength had been spent, its pilots killed, its planes destroyed. The Germans could only watch as their mobility collapsed. Entire battalions were stranded on sidings, armored trains lay crippled, and reinforcements destined for Normandy never arrived. What the Wehrmacht had once considered its secure lifeline had become its greatest vulnerability. For the Germans, the locomotive massacre was more than a tactical defeat. It was a revelation of helplessness, proof that the Allies not only ruled the skies, but also controlled the very heartbeat of the war on the ground. The destruction of 80 locomotives in a single day was not an isolated raid. It was part of a grand design, a strategy conceived months before D-Day to strangle the German army long before it could counterattack. The Allies called it the transportation plan. Its aim was ruthless in its simplicity: paralyze the enemy not by destroying his divisions, but by cutting the rails that moved them. In the spring of 1944, Allied planners understood the scale of the challenge. Germany still had dozens of divisions stationed across France, Belgium, and the Low Countries. If these forces could be brought swiftly to Normandy, the beachhead might be crushed before it could expand. But if they were delayed, even by days, the invasion could solidify. Bridges could be built, and Allied armies could pour into France. Every mile of rail torn apart, every locomotive destroyed, was another hour stolen from the German clock. The Thunderbolt was the weapon of choice for this war on movement. It was fast enough to sweep the countryside, tough enough to absorb flak, and powerful enough to tear through iron and steel. The Jug's missions were precise and merciless: hit marshalling yards, destroy bridges, leave wreckage blocking the tracks. Even when German crews repaired the rails, crippled locomotives meant there was nothing left to haul supplies forward. Day after day, waves of thunderbolts scoured the French countryside. Bridges across the Seine and Loire were shattered by bombs. Rail yards in Rouen, Amiens, and Tours burned under relentless attack. Locomotives were targeted with such single-minded ferocity that some Luftwaffe officers bitterly referred to the campaign as the strangulation. The Germans tried to adapt. They shifted trains at night, camouflaged them under trees, even stationed flak guns on flat cars to defend them. But the Allies countered with reconnaissance flights that scoured the landscape, infrared photography that revealed hidden trains, and fighter groups that struck at dawn and dusk. Every adjustment met a deadlier response. The effectiveness was undeniable. Intelligence reports by July 1944 showed rail traffic in northern France reduced by more than half. Divisions earmarked for Normandy were immobilized hundreds of miles away. Fuel shortages began to cripple German armor, while artillery shells piled up uselessly in depots. The strategy was not glamorous in the way of great tank battles or dramatic infantry assaults, yet its impact was devastating. The Wehrmacht's greatest strength had always been speed, the ability to move men and machines with frightening rapidity. The transportation plan cut out that heart, leaving German units stranded and isolated. The Locomotive massacre of June 1944 was the most dramatic single day of this campaign, but it was part of a relentless tide of destruction. The Thunderbolts were not fighting for glory in the skies. They were fighting to choke the lifelines of an enemy whose survival depended on steel rails and steam engines. By cutting those rails, the Allies ensured that the Normandy beaches would not be drowned beneath the weight of German counterattacks. It was strategy by paralysis, and it worked. In the days and weeks that followed the Locomotive massacre, the German army in France found itself hobbled. The destruction of trains and rail yards did not merely inconvenience the Wehrmacht, it crippled its ability to fight. Infantry units marched on foot for miles where once they would have traveled by train. Tank divisions waited days for fuel that never came. Ammunition intended for the guns of Normandy remained stacked in depots hundreds of miles away, useless and unreachable. The results were immediate on the battlefield. When German commanders attempted counterattacks against the Allied beachhead, their blows fell with only a fraction of the strength they had planned. A panzer division that should have struck with hundreds of tanks arrived piecemeal, short of fuel, short of shells, its fighting power blunted before it ever reached the line. The Wehrmacht was still dangerous, but it was shackled, forced to fight under conditions dictated by Allied air power. For the men who flew the Thunderbolts, there was a grim satisfaction. They knew that each raid, each train wrecked, shortened the war, yet they also carried the weight of loss, of comrades who never returned from low-level attacks, cut down by flak, or consumed in fireballs along the rails. The jug had proven its worth, but at a cost paid in blood. The legacy of those missions endured long after the last shots were fired. Historians would later note that no weapon system did more to disrupt German logistics in France than the P-47 Thunderbolt. Its role in the transportation plan became a textbook example of air power used not simply to bomb cities, but to paralyze the enemy's ability to move and fight. After the war, the Thunderbolt continued to serve in air forces around the world, in Latin America, in Europe, and in the Pacific. Yet its reputation was forever tied to the summer of 1944, when American pilots in their rugged jugs turned the French railways into graveyards of iron and steam. The aftermath of that single day was written in twisted rails and blackened engines, and its legacy was written in the knowledge that industrial power, harnessed to courage and strategy, could break even the most formidable war machine. War is often remembered for its great clashes, the tank battles at Kursk, the beaches of Normandy, the ruins of Stalingrad. But sometimes, the decisive blows fall not in the roar of infantry assaults, but in the quiet strangulation of an enemy's lifelines. The Locomotive massacre of June 1944 was one such blow. In a single day, American Thunderbolts reduced Germany's proud railway network to a smoking ruin. 80 locomotives, the steel giants that hauled Hitler's war machine across France, lay silent, their boilers burst, their wheels twisted, their tenders burning. What had once been the arteries of conquest became the wreckage of defeat. For Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal who had promised that Allied aircraft would never dominate the skies of Europe, the attack was more than a humiliation. It was a revelation of impotence. His Luftwaffe could no longer defend the Reich's most vital supply lines. He could only watch as the jug, ugly, indestructible, and merciless, shredded the Empire's mobility before his eyes. For the Americans, the day was proof of a new reality. Victory did not rest only on courage at the front, but on the marriage of industry and air power. Every jug that thundered down across the rails had been built by thousands of hands in factories back home. Riveters, machinists, farmers' daughters turned assembly workers. Their labor had given the pilots their weapon, and together they had struck a blow that echoed far beyond the battlefield. The lesson was stark. Modern war belonged to those who could master both the machine and the strategy to use it. Technology alone was not enough, nor was courage. It was the union of both, wielded with precision, that shattered the Reich's war machine. As the smoke cleared and the rails cooled, the silence that followed spoke louder than the explosions. The trains had stopped, the Reich had faltered, and history had turned another page toward liberation. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the Jug, had been born in the factories of America, forged in the skies of Europe, and consecrated on the rails of France. Its legacy remains, a symbol of iron, fire, and shock, and of the day when the steel heart of Germany was silenced by the thunder of American wings.